journey of Odysseus, explained in detail. Odysseus stood on the high walls of the fallen city Troy, gazing over the destruction below. His plan, the wooden horse, worked perfectly. Yet, as he surveyed the wreckage, there was no triumph in his heart. 10 years since he had last seen Ithaca, his home. With one last look at Troy, he descended the ruined walls and strode toward the Greek encampment. That night, there were final feasts and drunken revelries, men celebrating not only their victory, but their survival. But Odysseus remained at the edge of camp, watching the sea. He had a feeling that their journey home would not be so simple. As the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon gold, Odysseus strode to his ship and climbed aboard. Sail for Ithaca began. The ships moved as one, cutting through the sea like arrows. The raid on Ismarus, Odysseus and the Cicones. Following the destruction of Troy, the Greek forces began their journeys home. Among them was Odysseus, who commanded a fleet of black-sailed ships carrying his war-hardened men. His departure from the Trojan shores marked the beginning of what would become an arduous and myth-laden return journey. The first recorded event in his voyage was the raid on Ismarus, the stronghold of the Cicones, a Thracian tribe allied with the Trojans during the war. Upon sighting the island city of Ismarus, Odysseus made a calculated decision to attack. The Cicones, being allies of Troy, were considered fair targets for plunder, and their city held significant wealth and provisions that could aid in the Greek return voyage. The attack was swift and brutal. The Greeks, seasoned by a decade of warfare, overwhelmed the city's defenders in a surprise assault. Many of the Cicones were slain, while others fled into the hills. The city's storerooms were raided, and great quantities of food, wine, and treasure were seized. With the immediate battle won, Odysseus advised his men to make a quick departure, fearing retaliation. However, the Greek warriors, intoxicated by victory and the spoils of war, ignored his warnings. They indulged in feasting and celebration, squandering the valuable time needed for escape. Unbeknownst to the Greeks, the Cicones had not been completely subdued. Survivors from the initial attack had fled inland, summoning reinforcements from neighboring tribes. The Cicones were well trained in warfare and fought as a formidable cavalry force. At dawn, they launched a coordinated counteroffensive, descending upon the Greek encampment with a force much larger than the one initially defending the city. The Greeks, caught unprepared after a night of revelry, struggled to form a defensive line. The battle that followed was chaotic and costly. The Cicones fought with the fury of men defending their homeland, cutting down the Greek warriors in large numbers. The once mighty victors of Troy were now in full retreat, forced back toward their ships under the relentless assault. The cost of the Greeks' arrogance was severe. 6 men from every ship were slain before they could escape, a significant loss considering their long and uncertain journey ahead. The survivors managed to push off from the shore just in time to avoid complete annihilation. A lost course and a mysterious land. Following the disastrous raid on Ismarus, however, as they sailed into open waters, Zeus, the king of the gods, sent a violent storm. The winds raged for 2 days and 2 nights, tossing their ships like leaves on the sea. The storm was so powerful that the men had to lower their sails completely and simply let the waves carry them, as they had no control over the direction of their ships. After 9 days of drifting, the storm finally subsided, but they had been blown far off course. Zeus sent the storm likely as a trial or as a warning, not necessarily as divine wrath, but as a sign that the gods still held power over the fate of mortals. Odysseus and his fleet found themselves adrift in unknown waters. Their provisions were running low, and morale among the men was beginning to wane. After many days of wandering, they sighted land, island where gentle breezes carried the scent of flowers and ripened fruit. The shoreline was calm, and the island itself appeared unthreatening. Given their desperate need for rest and supplies, Odysseus made the tactical decision to make landfall. This decision, however, would soon prove perilous. Odysseus ordered a small scouting party to explore the island, determine whether it was inhabited, and locate any sources of food and water. The men ventured into the thick groves of trees and rolling meadows and soon encountered the Lotus-Eaters, a people of mysterious origin and peaceful demeanor. These inhabitants did not show hostility, but instead offered the Greeks a golden fruit, the lotus. Upon consuming the fruit, the men underwent an immediate transformation. Their exhaustion and hunger disappeared, but more dangerously, so did their memories of home. They lost all desire to return to Ithaca, overcome by an intoxicating euphoria and an unshakable sense of peace. The men who had eaten the lotus abandoned their sense of duty, their will to leave the island, and even their loyalty to their leader. Upon realizing the strange effect the lotus had on his men, Odysseus acted swiftly. Recognizing the danger of inaction, he personally sought out his enchanted comrades, dragging them away from the Lotus-Eaters and forcing them back toward the ships. Those who had not eaten the lotus helped to carry the others, who resisted, weeping and begging to stay. Odysseus did not allow them to take even a single bite more of the fruit. Rather than engage the Lotus-Eaters in conflict, Odysseus made the decision to retreat immediately. His men, still under the influence of the narcotic fruit, had to be physically restrained and tied to the benches of the ship to prevent them from leaping back into the waters and swimming to shore. As soon as the last man was aboard, he ordered his crew to row with all their strength, fleeing the island before more could succumb to the lotus's effects. With great effort, Odysseus and his fleet escaped the island of the Lotus-Eaters, but the encounter left an indelible mark. It was a stark reminder that the challenges of their journey would not always come in the form of monsters or storms, but sometimes in the subtler dangers of temptation and the slow erasure of purpose. This event served as the first true moral test in their journey home, and it would not be the last. The sea still stretched endlessly before them, and the gods were far from finished with Odysseus. The island of the Cyclopes. After narrowly escaping the land of the Lotus-Eaters, Odysseus and his fleet continued their voyage across the Mediterranean, driven by the unrelenting desire to return to Ithaca. Their journey, however, remained fraught with peril. A new challenge awaited them when they landed on an island inhabited by the Cyclopes, a race of one-eyed giants who lived in isolation, unbound by laws or civilization. Upon arriving on the island, Odysseus, ever curious and determined to explore, decided to lead a small scouting party inland. His men soon discovered a vast cave stocked with provisions, milk, cheese, and livestock pens filled with sheep and goats. Despite the pleas of his men to take what they needed and depart immediately. Odysseus, driven by both curiosity and a desire for hospitality, chose to remain and meet the cave's owner. This decision proved fateful. The cave belonged to Polyphemus, a towering Cyclops and the son of Poseidon. Upon returning, Polyphemus immediately recognized the intruders as foreigners, but instead of treating them with traditional Greek hospitality, he sealed the cave with a massive boulder and proceeded to devour two of Odysseus's men, establishing himself as a monstrous force rather than a potential ally. Odysseus quickly realized that brute strength alone would not allow them to escape. The boulder blocking the entrance was too large for men to move. Only deception and strategy could save them. Over the following day, he formulated a plan. He offered Polyphemus strong, undiluted wine, a gift meant to dull the giant's senses. When Polyphemus, now intoxicated, asked for his name, Odysseus told him he was called Nobody. As the Cyclops fell into a drunken stupor, Odysseus and his men took a sharpened wooden stake and drove it into his single eye, blinding him. When Polyphemus awoke in agony and cried out for help, his fellow Cyclopes called to him, asking who had harmed him. His response, "Nobody is hurting me," led them to believe he was suffering from divine punishment rather than an attack, and they did not come to his aid. Though blinded, Polyphemus still blocked the cave's entrance, preventing the Greeks from leaving. In response, Odysseus devised another clever escape. He and his remaining men tied themselves beneath the bellies of Polyphemus's sheep. When the Cyclops let his flock out to graze, he felt only their wool-covered backs and failed to detect the hidden Greeks beneath them. By morning, Odysseus and his crew had escaped the cave and rushed back to their ship. However, Odysseus's pride proved his undoing. As they sailed away, he could not resist taunting Polyphemus, revealing his true name in a final act of hubris. The blinded Cyclops, now knowing who had wronged him, called upon his father Poseidon to curse Odysseus, ensuring that his journey home would be long, painful, and filled with suffering. Odysseus and Iolus, the gift and the folly of the winds. Odysseus and his fleet arrived at Aeolia, an enigmatic floating island ruled by Aeolus, a minor god who controlled the winds. Unlike many of the other encounters Odysseus had experienced, Aeolus was not hostile. Recognizing the hero's plight and moved by his cunning and perseverance, Aeolus welcomed Odysseus as an honored guest. For a full month, Odysseus and his men were hosted in comfort, provided with food, rest, and counsel. Aeolus, though not an Olympian god, held significant power over the elements. When Odysseus expressed his desire to return to Ithaca, Aeolus devised a solution to aid him, gifting him a leather sack bound with unbreakable silver cords, containing all the winds of the world except for the gentle west wind, which would guide them home safely. Before Odysseus departed, Aeolus issued a single warning. The bag must remain sealed until Ithaca was reached. If opened prematurely, chaos would ensue and the voyage would be doomed. With the divine wind filling their sails, Odysseus's ships cut swiftly across the sea. For 9 days and nights, the Greeks sailed uninterrupted, Ithaca growing closer with each passing hour. At last, on the 10th day, they came within sight of their homeland. The fires of the island's hearths flickered in the distance, and Odysseus, exhausted but triumphant, allowed himself to rest. However, tragedy struck due to human folly. Odysseus, having remained awake and vigilant for the entire voyage, finally succumbed to exhaustion and fell into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, his men, driven by curiosity, greed, or mistrust, speculated about the contents of the bag Aeolus had gifted their leader. Believing it contained gold and treasure, perhaps a reward that Odysseus intended to hoard for himself, they untied the cords and unleashed the trapped winds. The moment the bag was opened, a cataclysm erupted. Hurricane-force winds, previously contained by divine magic, burst forth in all directions. The calm seas turned violent, and the fleet was thrown into chaos. Rather than arriving home as victors, the ships were swept away from Ithaca, terrifying speed, hurled back across the waters toward Aeolia. When Odysseus awoke, it was too late. His cries of anguish were drowned out by the howling winds as his ships were cast back upon the shores of Aeolus's island. Odysseus, humiliated and furious, approached Aeolus once more, pleading for his assistance. However, the god, now perceiving him as cursed by the Olympians, refused to help him a second time. Aeolus, fearing the wrath of the gods and unwilling to defy fate, cast Odysseus out of Aeolia, condemning him to continue his journey without divine assistance. Odysseus and the Laestrygonians, the massacre of the Greek fleet. Following the ill-fated encounter with Aeolus, Odysseus and his remaining fleet continued their voyage. Weary and demoralized, the Greek warriors sailed blindly into the unknown, seeking land where they could replenish their supplies and regain their strength. What they found instead was one of the most devastating encounters of their entire journey, the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals whose ferocity nearly ended Odysseus's expedition altogether. After days at sea, Odysseus and his fleet sighted a seemingly tranquil land with a broad harbor enclosed by towering cliffs. The natural formation provided perfect shelter for ships, allowing the fleet to anchor safely. A single narrow passage led into the bay, an inviting feature for weary sailors who longed for still waters and rest. Unwilling to take unnecessary risks after previous misfortunes, Odysseus made the crucial decision to keep his own ship moored outside the bay, leaving his men to explore the land. He sent a scouting party led by one of his trusted warriors to determine whether the inhabitants were friendly and whether the land could provide food and water for their journey. The scouts made their way inland and soon encountered a young woman near a great city. She led them to her father, King Antiphates, ruler of the Laestrygonians. However, unlike other rulers Odysseus had met, Antiphates did not offer hospitality or even the pretense of civility. Instead, he immediately seized one of the Greek scouts and devoured him alive. The surviving men fled in horror, sprinting back to their ships to warn their comrades. However, the alarm came too late. The Laestrygonians, no mere mortals but towering giants with inhuman strength and a taste for human flesh, had already begun their attack. The Laestrygonians, moving with terrifying speed, swarmed the harbor, blocking the narrow entrance to prevent the Greek ships from escaping. From the cliffs above, they hurled massive boulders down upon the fleet, shattering hulls and splintering masts with a single throw. The water ran red with the blood of drowned and crushed sailors as the giants waded into the bay, spearing men from their decks and consuming them on the spot. Odysseus, still stationed outside the bay, watched in horror as his fleet was systematically destroyed. He had no time to save his men. His single ship remained. All others had been lost. Odysseus and Circe, the enchantress of Aiaia. After the devastating loss of his fleet to the Laestrygonians, Odysseus found himself sailing with only a single surviving ship and a fraction of his original crew. The trials of his journey had not yet ended, and his next challenge would come in the form of Circe, a powerful sorceress who dwelled on the mysterious island of Aiaia. Weary and desperate for provisions, Odysseus and his men arrived on the island of Aiaia, a place of strange beauty. The land was lush, filled with dense forests and the sounds of unseen creatures. At its center stood the grand palace of Circe, a sorceress known for her magical abilities and mastery of potions. Odysseus, cautious from past experiences, decided not to lead the first expedition himself. Instead, he divided his men into two groups, sending one party led by Eurylochus to explore the island, while he remained behind to guard the ships. As Eurylochus and his men approached Circe's palace, they were greeted not with hostility, but with surprising warmth. Circe, appearing as a beautiful and seemingly hospitable woman, invited them inside and offered them food and drink. Unbeknownst to the weary sailors, the meal had been laced with powerful enchantments. The moment they consumed the feast, Circe's spell took effect. One by one, the men transformed into swine, their minds intact, but their bodies altered. Only Eurylochus, sensing the danger and refusing to partake in the meal, escaped the fate of his comrades. Terrified, he fled back to Odysseus and relayed the horrifying news. Determined to save his men, Odysseus armed himself and set out for Circe's palace alone. Before he could enter, however, he was intercepted by the god Hermes, who had been sent by Zeus to aid him. Hermes, recognizing that brute force would not work against the powerful sorceress, gave Odysseus a magical herb called mole, a divine antidote that would protect him from Circe's spells. Odysseus entered the palace and, like his men before him, was offered enchanted food. However, thanks to Hermes' intervention, the spell had no effect on him. When Circe attempted to use her magic, she was shocked to find Odysseus unaffected. Realizing she had met a man beyond her power, Circe quickly yielded to Odysseus' demands, swearing an oath not to harm him and agreeing to restore his men to their human forms. Odysseus and the Underworld, seeking prophecy among the dead. Having escaped the temptations of Circe's island, Odysseus' journey did not lead him immediately toward Ithaca. Instead, the sorceress revealed that his path home required him to undertake a perilous and supernatural detour to sail beyond the mortal realm and descend into the underworld. Only there could he consult the blind seer Tiresias, who alone possessed the knowledge to guide him safely home. Under Circe's guidance, Odysseus and his remaining crew set sail for the farthest reaches of the world, where the river Oceanus flowed into the boundaries of the underworld, a realm ruled by Hades and Persephone. Upon reaching the designated shore, Odysseus carried out the ritual of necromancy, an ancient Greek practice used to summon and communicate with the dead. The ritual required Odysseus to dig a trench and pour libations of milk, honey, wine, and water, followed by the sacrifice of a black ram. The blood of the sacrifice acted as a conduit, drawing forth the spirits of the dead who craved sustenance from the living realm. Odysseus, sword in hand, guarded the offering, allowing only the shade of Tiresias to drink first. Tiresias' spirit emerged from the gathering dead, and the blind prophet revealed the hard truths of Odysseus' fate, Poseidon's wrath. Odysseus remained cursed by the sea god for blinding his son Polyphemus, ensuring that his journey home would be prolonged and dangerous. The cattle of Helios. Tiresias warned that Odysseus and his men would come upon the island of Thrinacia, home to the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. If they harmed these animals, divine retribution would follow. A troubled homecoming. Even if Odysseus reached Ithaca, his troubles would not end. He would find his household overrun with suitors vying for Penelope's hand, believing him dead. A final journey. After reclaiming his home, Odysseus would still not escape fate. He was destined to undertake another journey inland, where he must plant an oar in the earth, signifying the end of his life as a wanderer and the fulfillment of his fate. Beyond Tiresias, Odysseus spoke with several spirits from his past, each encounter shedding light on the themes of mortality, heroism, and loss. Elpenor. The first spirit to appear was that of Elpenor, one of Odysseus's own men, who had died at Circe's palace in a drunken fall. Unburied and dishonored, Elpenor begged Odysseus to return to Aeolia and grant him a proper burial, an act of piety that Odysseus swore to complete. Anticlea. Among the restless dead, Odysseus encountered the spirit of his mother, Anticlea, whom he had left alive in Ithaca years before. Stricken with grief, he attempted to embrace her, but as a mere shade, she slipped through his grasp. Anticlea revealed that she had died not from old age, but from longing for her son, a tragic consequence of his absence. The spirits of fallen heroes. Odysseus also met several legendary warriors who had perished in Troy, including Agamemnon and Achilles. Agamemnon, betrayed and murdered upon his return home, warned Odysseus of the dangers awaiting him in Ithaca. Achilles, once the mightiest of Greek warriors, admitted that he would rather be a living peasant than a dead king, a stark reflection on the nature of glory and the afterlife. Odysseus's journey into the house of the dead was not without its terrors. As more spirits emerged, he glimpsed the punishments of those condemned to eternal torment. Tantalus, cursed to stand in a pool of water that receded whenever he tried to drink, while fruit dangled just beyond his grasp. Sisyphus, forever pushing a boulder up a hill only for it to roll back down for all eternity. These images reinforce the Greek notion that the afterlife was not a place of glory, but of regret and suffering, where even the greatest warriors could not escape fate's cruel hand. Having obtained the knowledge he needed, Odysseus knew he could linger no longer in the land of the dead. Before the shades overwhelmed him, he and his men fled back to their ship and set sail, leaving the underworld behind. However, the weight of what he had learned followed him. Odysseus now knew that his journey home was far from over. The trials ahead would test him more than ever, and his survival would depend on whether he and his men could avoid the temptations and pitfalls foretold by Tiresias. Odysseus and the Sirens, the temptation of forbidden knowledge. After his descent into the underworld and the revelations from the prophet Tiresias, Odysseus continued his voyage toward Ithaca, now fully aware of the trials that still awaited him. One such trial was his encounter with the Sirens, creatures of mythic danger renowned for their irresistible song. Unlike the previous threats Odysseus had faced, monsters, storms, and hostile forces, the Sirens posed a different kind of challenge, not of brute force, but of willpower. Their danger lay in their seductive voices, which had lured countless sailors to their doom. Odysseus, always the seeker of knowledge, was determined to hear their song without succumbing to their deadly pull. The Sirens were mystical beings believed to be part woman, part bird, residing on an isolated rocky island in the Western Sea. According to legend, their song was so enchanting that any sailor who heard it was driven mad with desire, causing them to steer their ship toward the Sirens only to be dashed against the jagged rocks surrounding their domain. Unlike other mythological creatures that rely on brute force or trickery, the Sirens' power was purely psychological, a weapon of temptation and knowledge. Their voices promised wisdom, foretelling hidden truths and divine secrets, making them irresistible to those who sought greater understanding of the world. Forewarned by Circe, Odysseus knew that his ship would pass near the Sirens' island and that his men had to be prepared. Instead of avoiding the danger altogether, he devised a plan to experience their song while ensuring the safety of his crew. Wax in the ears. Odysseus instructed his men to plug their ears with beeswax, preventing them from hearing the siren song. The bound captain, wanting to hear the song without being drawn to his doom, Odysseus had his men tie him firmly to the mast of the ship, ordering them not to release him under any circumstances, no matter how much he begged or struggled. Steering blindly, with their ears sealed and their captain secured, the crew rowed forward, blindly trusting Odysseus's instructions. As the ship sailed past the Sirens' rocky shore, Odysseus was the only one to hear their voices. The Sirens, seeing a potential victim, directed their song at him, weaving a melody that promised knowledge beyond mortal reach. Come closer, Odysseus, great warrior of the Greeks. No man has ever passed without heeding our call. We know all that has been and all that shall be. Come, let us tell you the secrets of the gods, the glories of war, and the fate that awaits you beyond the horizon. The song filled Odysseus with an overwhelming desire to break free, to cast himself into the sea and swim toward the source of the voice. He thrashed against his bonds, pleading with his men to release him, but they, deaf to the siren song, ignored his cries and tightened his restraints further. The ship continued forward, and as the Sirens' island faded into the distance, the spell began to weaken. Only when the melody had completely vanished did Odysseus signal his men to remove the wax from their ears and untie him. He had heard the song of the Sirens and survived, but not without struggle. Odysseus and the peril of Scylla and Charybdis. After narrowly escaping the temptation of the Sirens, Odysseus and his men faced an even graver threat, the twin terrors of Scylla and Charybdis. Unlike previous challenges where wit or strength could grant victory, this encounter was one of inevitable loss, forcing Odysseus to make a grim choice between two deadly fates. Situated in a narrow strait, Scylla, a monstrous, many-headed sea creature, lurked on one side, while Charybdis, an enormous, ship-swallowing whirlpool, threatened the other. No ship had ever passed through unscathed, and Odysseus, having been forewarned by Circe, knew that his leadership would be tested like never before. Scylla was a towering serpent-like monster with 6 long necks, each ending in a fanged head. From her perch in the cliffs, she would snatch sailors from passing ships, devouring them alive. Charybdis, on the opposite side of the strait, was a living maelstrom, a monstrous whirlpool that sucked in and destroyed entire vessels 3 times a day. Sailing too close to Scylla meant losing 6 men to her ravenous jaws. Steering toward Charybdis risked losing the entire ship and crew in her depths. There was no safe path, only the choice of lesser destruction. Before reaching the strait, Circe had advised Odysseus on how to navigate the peril. She warned him that trying to fight Scylla would be useless. She was an immortal terror, beyond the power of any man to defeat. Instead, Circe urged him to accept the loss of 6 men rather than risk everything to Charybdis. Odysseus, ever the strategist, recognized that while sacrificing a few was agonizing, it was the only way to ensure the survival of the majority. He chose to sail closer to Scylla, avoiding the pull of Charybdis's vortex. However, he did not inform his men of the full danger ahead, fearing that panic would lead to disaster. Just as Circe had forewarned, Scylla struck with terrifying speed. Before the men could react, her 6 heads shot down from the cliffs, seizing 6 unfortunate sailors and dragging them into her gaping mouths. Their screams echoed across the sea as they were devoured alive. Odysseus, though devastated, forced himself to keep moving forward, resisting the urge to fight back, knowing it would only lead to more loss. His ship, battered but intact, slipped past the monster's reach and cleared the strait. Odysseus and the cattle of Helios, the crime that sealed their fate. Having barely escaped the twin terrors of Scylla and Charybdis, Odysseus and his remaining men found themselves exhausted, battered, and desperately in need of rest. As they sailed onward, the island of Thrinacia appeared on the horizon, a lush and radiant land bathed in the golden light of Helios, the sun god. It was an island of divine beauty, untouched by war or suffering, its fields abundant with the immortal cattle and sheep of Helios, who watched over them with great jealousy. Odysseus, remembering the dire warnings, urged his men to bypass the island. He begged them not to land, fearing the temptation it posed. But his crew, exhausted from their trials, rebelled against his command, insisting they needed shelter from a looming storm. Eurylochus, one of his most outspoken officers, accused Odysseus of excessive cruelty, arguing that the men had endured too much suffering and needed to rest. Despite his fears, Odysseus relented, but only after making his men swear an oath not to touch the sacred cattle under any circumstances. With the promise secured, they made camp on the shore, preparing to wait out the storm. For several days, the winds howled and the sea raged. The storm, seemingly unnatural in its persistence, trapped them on Thrinacia far longer than expected. Their supplies dwindled, and as hunger gnawed at their resolve, their loyalty to Odysseus's command began to waver. Desperation turned to whispers to plotting, until finally, with Odysseus fast asleep from exhaustion, the inevitable act of defiance took place. Led by Eurylochus, the men broke their oath and slaughtered the finest cattle of Helios, offering them in a makeshift sacrifice to the gods, while feasting on their divine flesh. Eurylochus, believing they could atone for their transgression, prayed to the gods, offering libations and promising to build a great temple to Helios upon their return to Ithaca. But this was not a crime that could be forgiven. The cattle were not mere animals, they were sacred to Helios himself. When Odysseus awoke and saw what had happened, he was horrified. He knew their fate was now sealed. "You have doomed us all," he cried. But his words came too late. As the sun rose, the immortal cattle, though slain, displayed unnatural signs of divine rage. Their skins crawled, their bones still twitched upon the ground, and an eerie, unholy sound echoed across the island. Helios, enraged beyond measure, ascended to Olympus and demanded retribution from Zeus, the king of the gods. He threatened to withdraw his light from the world, plunging the earth into eternal darkness if the transgressors were not punished. Zeus, the wielder of the thunderbolt, promised justice. He would let Odysseus and his men set sail, but no man who had partaken in the feast would live to see Ithaca. When the storm finally broke, Odysseus and his men set sail once more, unknowingly heading toward their doom. As they reached open waters, Zeus unleashed his divine fury. A massive storm erupted, black clouds swallowing the sky, and a single bolt of lightning shattered their ship. The men, now helpless in the raging sea, were dragged beneath the waves, swallowed by the depths, punished for their sacrilege. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to the wreckage as his last remaining companions perished before his eyes. Odysseus and Calypso. The captivity on Ogygia. After the destruction of his ship and the loss of his crew, Odysseus drifted alone upon the vast sea, clinging to the wreckage, battered by the wrath of the gods. For 9 days, the relentless waves carried him across the endless blue, his body weakened, his spirit nearly broken. Fate, however, had not yet abandoned him. On the 10th day, he washed ashore on the remote island of Ogygia, the dwelling of the nymph Calypso. Ogygia was an island of extraordinary beauty, described in divine, almost surreal terms. Verdant forests, blooming meadows, and fragrant flowers covered the land, while its shores sparkled with crystalline water. Birds of purest song filled the air, and even the caves shimmered with divine craftsmanship. At the heart of this paradise lived Calypso, a minor goddess and daughter of the Titan Atlas. She ruled the island alone, untouched by the mortal world, existing in a realm of timeless serenity. Yet, for Odysseus, Ogygia was not a sanctuary, it was a prison. When Calypso found the shipwrecked Odysseus upon her shore, she nursed him back to health, tending to his wounds with divine care. Enchanted by his strength, intellect, and resilience, she soon fell deeply in love with him. Calypso, a goddess untouched by time, had lived in solitude for centuries now. She had found a companion, and she had no intention of letting him leave. For 7 years, Odysseus remained on Ogygia, kept as Calypso's unwilling consort. She offered him immortality, promising to make him her eternal husband, allowing him to remain by her side forever, free from the burdens of age and suffering. Yet, despite the pleasures of Ogygia, despite the divine beauty of Calypso herself, Odysseus never ceased to long for Ithaca. Night after night, he sat upon the shore, gazing toward the horizon, yearning for Penelope, Telemachus, and the home he had left behind. Though Odysseus was stranded, his fate had not gone unnoticed by the gods. His patron Athena had watched from Olympus, pitying the mortal hero who had endured so much, only to be trapped by love he did not seek. She appealed to Zeus, arguing that Odysseus had suffered enough and should be allowed to return home. Zeus agreed, and he sent Hermes, the divine messenger, to deliver his decree to Calypso. When Hermes arrived, he commanded Calypso to release Odysseus, declaring that the gods had willed it so. Furious and heartbroken, Calypso protested the injustice. She pointed out that male gods often kept mortal lovers, yet she, a goddess, was denied the same right. But Zeus's command was final. Calypso had no choice but to let Odysseus go. Though reluctant, Calypso agreed to aid Odysseus in his departure. She provided him with tools, divine materials, and guidance, allowing him to construct a sturdy raft. She also stocked it with provisions, ensuring he would survive the voyage ahead. Before he left, Calypso made one final attempt to persuade him to stay. She reminded him that if he sailed away, he would once again face hardship, suffering, and the threat of death. With her, he could live in peace and eternal youth, untouched by the trials of the mortal world. But Odysseus's heart belonged to Ithaca. He thanked Calypso for her kindness, but remained steadfast. He chose his mortal fate over immortality, proving once more that his true strength lay not just in his cunning, but in his unbreakable resolve. With that, he set sail, leaving Ogygia behind, yet not without a sense of melancholy for the love he had been offered, but could never accept. Odysseus and the Phaeacians, the final respite before Ithaca. After escaping the captivity of Calypso, Odysseus embarked on what he believed to be his final voyage home. But fate, once again, conspired against him. The sea god Poseidon, still wrathful, unleashed a mighty storm that wrecked Odysseus's raft and sent him tumbling into the vast ocean. Clinging to wreckage, barely surviving, he was cast ashore on the land of the Phaeacians, the people of Scheria. Odysseus washed up on the shores of Scheria, the island kingdom of the Phaeacians, a people renowned for their seafaring prowess and devotion to the gods. Exhausted, battered, and naked, he collapsed on the beach, covering himself in leaves for warmth and concealment. The next morning, his fate took a fortunate turn. Nausicaa, the daughter of King Alcinous and Queen Arete, had been sent a divine vision by Athena, instructing her to wash clothes at the riverbank. Accompanied by her maidens, she came across the sleeping Odysseus. Though startled by his ragged appearance, she did not flee in fear. Instead, demonstrating the Phaeacians' tradition of hospitality, she spoke kindly to him, offering food, clothing, and guidance to the royal palace. Upon reaching the palace, Odysseus marveled at its grandeur, with bronze walls, golden doors, and immortal dogs forged by Hephaestus himself. Guided by Athena's counsel, he approached Queen Arete first, a gesture of humility and wisdom that won her favor. King Alcinous, a generous ruler, welcomed the mysterious stranger, treating him with great honor. As was custom, he did not immediately ask Odysseus his identity, but first offered him food, drink, and rest. The next day, a great banquet was held in his honor, during which the bard Demodocus sang of the Trojan War. It was then, hearing of his own trials and suffering, that Odysseus wept, revealing his true identity at last. Upon learning that their guest was Odysseus, the hero of Troy, the Phaeacians marveled at his story. Alcinous, moved by his suffering, offered him a ship and safe passage home to Ithaca. Before his departure, the king hosted athletic contests, testing Odysseus' strength in discus, foot races, wrestling, and more. Though Odysseus initially refused to participate, an insult from a young Phaeacian noble spurred his pride and warrior spirit, leading him to outperform all challengers. To honor him further, the Phaeacians presented him with lavish gifts, including gold, fine robes, and weapons, all of which would accompany him on his final voyage. Odysseus returns to Ithaca, the final trial. After 20 years, 10 years of war in Troy, and 10 years of wandering the seas, Odysseus finally set foot on Ithaca. His journey, marked by divine trials, tragic losses, and hard-won wisdom, was now at its final chapter. Yet, the greatest test remained, reclaiming his home and restoring his place as king. Unlike the triumphant homecomings of other warriors, Odysseus could not reveal himself immediately. Ithaca had changed in his absence. His palace was overrun with arrogant suitors who had long presumed him dead and were now vying for Penelope's hand and his throne. Thus, Odysseus did not return as a victorious king, but as a beggar, an exile in his own land. He would need all his cunning, patience, and strength to restore what was lost. As Odysseus awoke upon the shores of Ithaca, he did not recognize his homeland. Athena, ever his patron and protector, appeared before him, revealing the truth. Ithaca had become a land of treachery, and he would need stealth and strategy, not brute force, to reclaim it. Disguising him as an elderly beggar, Athena instructed him to seek refuge with Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd, who had remained faithful despite his long absence. This transformation allowed Odysseus to move unseen, gathering information and preparing for the battle ahead. Odysseus, in his beggar's guise, was welcomed by Eumaeus, who, though unaware of his true identity, treated him with hospitality, a reflection of his unwavering loyalty. It was here that Odysseus reunited with Telemachus, his son, who had grown up believing his father was lost forever. Athena removed the disguise in a divine revelation, and father and son embraced at last, weeping for the lost years. Yet their reunion was brief, for they had a kingdom to reclaim and enemies to overthrow. Meanwhile, the suitors feasted in Odysseus' own hall, squandering his wealth, disrespecting his legacy, and pressuring Penelope to choose a new husband. Among them were Antinous, the most arrogant and cruel, and Eurymachus, the most deceitful. Odysseus, still in disguise, entered the palace as a beggar. He observed the corruption, tested the loyalty of his servants, and endured the mockery and abuse of the suitors, all while keeping his identity hidden. Yet, not all in the palace were blind to his presence. Penelope, still faithful, sensed something familiar in the stranger. She remained steadfast, delaying her decision to remarry by weaving and unweaving a funeral shroud, a trick that had allowed her to stall the suitors for years. As tensions in the palace grew, Penelope proposed a challenge, one that only Odysseus could win. She announced that she would marry the man who could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads, a feat of strength and skill beyond the reach of the suitors. One by one, the suitors tried and failed. Then the beggar stepped forward. With ease, he strung the bow, pulled back the string, and released the arrow, sending it cleanly through all 12 axe heads. The hall fell into stunned silence. Before the suitors could react, Odysseus shed his disguise, standing before them in his full, wrathful glory. With Telemachus, Eumaeus, and his loyal allies, Odysseus unleashed his fury upon the suitors, slaying them one by one. Antinous, the most brazen of them all, fell first, an arrow piercing his throat mid-drink. Eurymachus, realizing their doom, tried to plead for mercy, but Odysseus showed none. The blood of the usurpers stained the halls of his palace. The disloyal maids who had consorted with the suitors were also punished, while those who had remained loyal were spared. With the suitors dead and Ithaca restored, Odysseus had one final test to pass, convincing Penelope that he was truly her long-lost husband. Cautious after years of deceit and false hope, Penelope devised a test. She told the supposed stranger that their marriage bed had been moved from their room. Odysseus, knowing the truth that their bed was built into the very foundation of their home and could not be moved, reacted in outrage, proving his identity. At last, Penelope knew her husband had returned, and they were reunited. With his kingdom restored and his place as king reaffirmed, Odysseus had finally completed his journey. Yet the prophecy of Tiresias still lingered. His fate was not yet entirely sealed. One final journey would await him beyond Ithaca's shores. But for now, at last, Odysseus had come home.